The gearbox sits on a steel bench at the Royal Aircraft Establishment Farnborough, its casing still carrying a thin skin of engine oil from a machine that crashed in Austria 3 months earlier. It is the size of a large accordion, cast in magnesium alloy, and it weighs 18 pounds less than the drawings captured with it suggested it should. Two output shafts emerge from the top, angled outward at exactly 6 degrees, and it is that angle, not the casing, not the alloy, that stops the engineer standing over it from reaching for his tea. No British or American engineer has opened one of these intact before. What they find inside, once they strip the housing down to its last bearing race, will force the Royal Navy to rewrite how it thinks about helicopters landing on a moving ship deck. The machine this gearbox came from is a Flettner Fl 282 Kolibri Hummingbird, designed by Anton Flettner, a German engineer who had spent the 1930s convinced that a single main rotor with a tail rotor to fight its torque was a waste of engine power. His answer was two rotors, intermeshing, tilted outward from each other like open scissors, spinning in opposite directions so their torque cancelled itself out. No tail rotor. No tail boom whipping torque into the airframe. The Kolibri had flown reconnaissance and anti-submarine spotting duties for the Kriegsmarine since 1942, small enough to operate from the deck of a cruiser, light enough that a crew of two could push it into a hangar the size of a delivery van. By the time Allied forces reached the Flettner works at Johannisthal in the spring of 1945, most of the factory's records were ash. What survived was scattered, airframes half-built, a handful of flight logs, and, in a supply depot outside Bad Tölz, one complete lower gearbox still crated. The engineer with his hands on the bench is Wing Commander Reginald Bree, who had spent the war trying to work out why German helicopter engines never seemed to shake themselves apart the way early British and American prototypes did. He removes the top housing bolts one at a time, in sequence, because the assembly drawings, translated overnight by a linguist attached to the technical intelligence team, show a torque sequence stamped directly onto the casing in German machinists' shorthand. That alone tells him something. No wartime production line stamps torque sequences onto a casing unless the tolerance below it has no room for a mechanic's guesswork. If a script like this one is the kind of thing you want more of, real engineers, real machines, the war fought in workshops as much as on beaches, this is where you'd hit subscribe. So the next examination finds you instead of the other way round. Back to the bench. Bree lifts the housing free and finds two bevel gear sets, one for each rotor mast, meshed into a single central drive pinion turned by the Bramo SH-14A radial engine mounted just forward of the cockpit. He measures the backlash between the gear teeth with a dial indicator clamped to the bench, the amount of play before one tooth actually drives the other. British production gearboxes of the same era ran backlash tolerances of 4 to 6 thousandths of an inch, already tight by wartime standards. The Flettner gearbox measures at 1.5 thousandths. Bree checks the indicator twice, resets it, and runs the measurement a third time before he writes the figure into his notebook. Because a number that small usually means a misreading, not a German factory floor in 1943 holding tolerances finer than a Rolls-Royce aero engine shop in Derby, 200 miles east. The same week Bree is bent over this bench, the Red Army is fighting through the streets of Königsberg, and every serviceable aircraft the Luftwaffe still owns is being flown, not tested. Nobody in Germany in April 1945 has the luxury of asking why a helicopter gearbox needs tolerances this fine. Bree does have that luxury 6 months later, in a country that has stopped shooting at him, and the question is the whole reason he's here. He goes deeper. The two output shafts don't just spin the rotors, They have to spin them in a fixed relationship to each other, because the whole design depends on the blades of one rotor never touching the blades of the other as they scissor past, inches apart, at up to 200 revolutions per minute. Bree strips the shaft assembly and finds a timing mechanism he hasn't seen described in any Allied helicopter patent. A synchronizing shaft running the width of the gearbox, connecting both rotor masts mechanically so that if one rotor's timing drifted even slightly, the shaft itself would physically resist it, forcing the two rotors back into phase. He sits back from the bench for a long moment, takes off his glasses and cleans them on his sleeve before he writes anything down. It's the kind of gesture a man makes when he needs a few seconds before committing an opinion to paper. What he writes, eventually, is that the rotors are not being kept apart by pilot skill or by a stiff enough structure to survive a near miss. They are being kept apart by a machine that makes the miss physically impossible. The intermeshing rotors on the Kolibri pass within roughly 10 inches of each other on every single rotation, and the synchronizing shaft is the only thing standing between that and a mid-air collision of the aircraft's own blades. Get the timing wrong by a few degrees and the machine destroys itself in under a second. Bree's report goes up the chain to the Ministry of Aircraft Production and a second team, this one from the Admiralty, because a helicopter that can be built small enough for a ship deck is exactly what the Royal Navy has been asking for since 1943. Asks for the gearbox to be bench-run under load. They rig the output shafts to dummy rotor hubs, spin the assembly with an electric motor standing in for the Brahmo engine, and deliberately introduce a small torque imbalance on one output shaft. The kind of imbalance a real rotor blade might produce after picking up a dent or a few pounds of ice. The synchronizing shaft holds the timing within a fraction of a degree. They increase the imbalance. It still holds. A junior engineer on the Admiralty team, watching the deflection gauges rather than the spinning shafts, says nothing for almost a minute. Then quietly asks Bree whether the Germans built this to fly off a rolling deck on purpose. That's the layer that changes the shape of the whole investigation, because a rolling ship deck does exactly what that bench rig just simulated. It feeds an uneven, unpredictable load into a rotor system with every gust and every wave. Every Allied helicopter under development in 1945, the American Sikorsky designs, the early British Sierva and Bristol projects, used a single main rotor and depended on a tail rotor bolted onto the end of a long boom to cancel torque. That boom is a lever arm, and a lever arm amplifies any twisting motion from the sea into a much larger swing at the tail. Engineers on both sides of the Atlantic already suspected this made single-rotor helicopters harder to fly safely off small ships. Nobody had proof. Nobody had a mechanism to point to. Now they do. The Kolibri's synchronizing shaft is not a refinement. It is the reason the aircraft exists in the shape that it does. Flettner did not design intermeshing rotors because they looked efficient on paper. He designed them because a machine with no tail boom, no long lever arm for the sea to grab hold of, and a mechanical timing shaft holding both rotors in lockstep could be flown off a deck the size of a tennis court in weather that would ground anything with a tail rotor. The consequence lands within the year. The Royal Navy's Naval Air Fighting Development Unit, briefed on Bree's findings, pushes its own shipboard rotorcraft trials toward compact, low-footprint designs rather than the larger single-rotor machines the Fleet Air Arm had initially favoured. And American observers attached to the British trials carry the same gearbox data back to Washington, where it feeds directly into the Navy's post-war interest in intermeshing and coaxial rotor configurations for shipboard use. A design lineage that surfaces again a few years later in Charles Cayman's Syncropter helicopters, built for exactly the deck landing problem Bree's bench had just proven was solvable. Within a decade, intermeshing rotor helicopters are lifting downed aircrew off the decks of destroyers in seas that would have grounded a tail rotor machine an hour earlier. Nobody flying those rescue missions ever hears the name Anton Flettner. Most of them owe him their aircraft's spine. The gearbox itself outlives almost everyone who examined it. It sits today in a storage collection connected to the Royal Air Force Museum, catalogued, unremarkable to look at, one exhibit among thousands of pieces of captured German hardware that never made it to a display case with a spotlight over it. Visitors who do see photographs of it read a caption about rotor synchronization and move on in 4 seconds, the way you move past most engineering footnotes. What the caption doesn't say is that the 18 inches of machined steel and magnesium in that casing quietly settled an argument the entire Allied helicopter industry hadn't finished having. The argument over whether a tail rotor was a necessary evil or just an unexamined habit. Reginald Bree's notebook, if you could find it in the archive boxes at Farnborough, still has that backlash figure written in it. Checked 3 times because he knew that a number that precise, coming out of a country that was losing the war while it machined it, was not a coincidence. It was a decision. Somebody in Germany, with fuel running out and cities burning, chose to hold a tolerance of 1.5 thousandths of an inch on a helicopter gearbox. Not because anyone was watching, but because the 10 inches of clearance between those two rotors depended on it. And there is no partial credit for getting that number almost right.